Hey everybody, welcome back to Library Says. My name is Jamie, and today I'm going to tell you all about my favorite books I read in 2020. 2020 was all over the place for me in a lot of ways, like I assume it is for most people, but especially in reading. I had a lot of good, I had a lot of bad. I had a top 10 worst reads of 2020 video that I just posted, and next up is my best of 2020. And for this one, I thought I could limit it down to 10, but honestly, I was surprised at how many 5-star reads I had when I went back and checked, and how difficult it was to narrow it down to just 10. So I've decided to go with 15, which is a lot. And I am going to count down from 15 to 1 being the very best, my very favorite book I read. Obviously there's some wiggle room in here. It was sort of a gut decision as I went through and ordered these, but let's get started. Number 15 on my list, Daddy Longlegs. So this is a classic. It was written in the early 1900s and it reads like historical fiction, but it was contemporary fiction when it was published. It is about a young orphan girl who, upon reaching the age when she would age out of the orphanage, is given a mysterious gift by a mysterious benefactor, someone who wants to remain anonymous, a man who wants to pay for her to go to a university and get a degree, and this is just beyond her wildest dreams. And it's all based on a story that she wrote when she was in the orphanage. He read it and loved it and thought, this person has potential, I want to pay for her to go to school. So there you go. It's epistolary, so the whole book is letters that she is writing to this benefactor, who she is nicknamed Daddy Longlegs, and she writes him letters letting him know of her progress, and literally the whole book is her letters as she goes through college over the years and her developing relationships and coming into her own and figuring out who she wants to be as an adult while her relationship with Daddy Longlegs evolves. For a book that was written over 100 years ago, I loved it. I related to this character so much. For someone who would be like 120 years old or something at this point, she was someone I knew. She was every person I know at her age. The thing that was really wild about this is that it predates suffrage for women, and she talks about that. She talks about, like, why can't I vote? And it makes little commentary like that blew my mind, because as the author is writing this, that is the state of the world. Women don't have the right to vote, and it just really hit me as I was reading it. But I love this. It's a good time. It's a very quick read for a classic. I think it needs to be read more often, more widely, and I want to hear more people having read it and discussing it. You should give it a go. Number 14 on my list, Eliza and Her Monsters. It took me forever to get to this book. It came out, I think, in 2017, 2018, so it's been a while, but for whatever reason I had put it off, and I finally read it this year, and I loved it. So you're following Eliza, who is the anonymous creator of a worldwide phenomenon of a webcomic. No one in her real life knows that she does this, but she is a sensation. She is famous on the internet, but under a username, and no one knows her real identity. In her real life, she has a lot of troubled relationships. She has a lot of struggles with depression and mental health, and she's really struggling, and she's in high school while all of this is happening. And then there's a new boy who moves to her town and starts at her school. He writes fan fiction for her webcomic, and they know each other from online, like they're online personas. She finds out pretty quickly, this isn't a spoiler, who he is, but does not tell him who she is. So there's a disparity there with their relationship. I loved this so much. I loved the fandom elements because I love fandom, and I thought it was such a fantastic representation of fandom, the good and the bad, and how big of a part of someone's life it can really be, and how separate and isolated it can feel from the rest of someone's life. I loved the relationships, the familial relationships, especially Eliza and her mother. I loved this central friendship turned romance. I loved the drama of it, and I thought the mental health rep and depression rep was all just fantastic. A trigger warning for some suicidal ideation. Not a ton, but it does make an appearance. But I just thought it was wonderful. And it was so much more of an emotional and important read than I anticipated it being. I thought it was just gonna be kind of a fun fandom-y thing, which it is, but it has so much more meat to it and more depth to it than I expected. Number 13 on my list is a romance, sort of. beach read. So I read this as an arc before it came out later in the year, and I read it in one day. Granted, it was during quarantine. I wasn't doing anything else. I was literally laying on my couch all day. So this book is about two writers who are staying at like lakeside cabins next door to each other. Our main character, she writes romance novels, and then her neighbor, he writes like dark literary fiction. And they're both sort of struggling to write their next book. Our main character is struggling because her dad has just died, and she found out after he died that he'd been having this like long-term affair with another woman, and it wrecked her whole belief system, her belief in love. She writes romance novels because she saw her parents be in love her whole life, and she believed in it, and she believed in the power of it. And then to find out that her dad was having an affair all these years, it really wrecked her foundations. So she's struggling. So she moves into this lakeside cabin. It's not really a beach house. And tries to figure out who was her dad really, and tries to figure out, can she continue to write? And if she writes, can she continue to write romance novels like she has in the past? Meanwhile, next door neighbor, she was in I think a master's writing program with him way back when, and they did not get along. They were sort of adversaries. Now, through circumstances, they decide to have this sort of bet where they're both going to swap genres. He's going to write a romance, she's going to write dark literary fiction, and the first one to sell their manuscript to a publisher wins. And along the way, she is going to take him on these like fun, flirty, romantic outings to inspire him, and he's going to take her on outings to inspire her in a darker, more literary way. I'm not going to tell you more than that. I loved their relationship. I loved this sort of hate to love element. I loved the structure of the bet. I loved how much depth this had. It wasn't just a romance. The romance was honestly a small part of it. It was more about the main character like coming to terms with what she thought she knew, what is real, who she is, as a writer, as a person, as a member of her family. I just loved it. I loved it. And for it to make me laugh out loud and to make me cry and to feel so many emotions, I was so impressed, and I had a great time with it, and it was one of my first 5-star reads of the year. Number 12 on my list is Return of the King by Megan Whalen Turner. This is the 6th and final book in the Queen's Thief series, and it is a wild ride. I'm really not going to tell you anything about this because it is the final book of a 6-book series, so I don't want to spoil anything, but if you haven't read these and you're at all interested in fantasy, especially like sort of historical fantasy, this is the way to go. Definitely give it a go. It really starts almost middle grade and then works its way up to, I think the last few books really feel like adult fantasy, but I think it's mostly classified as YA. But you're following Eugenides, who is a thief, and he gets into all sorts of shenanigans and ends up in the court of Atolia, which is a rival kingdom from his kingdom. There are a lot of secrets, and there are a lot of amazing angsty relationships, and there's imminent war. And really, this is a series that has been going on now, I think it's like 25 years in the making from the release of the first book in the series. And so there were a lot of hopes pinned on this final book, this conclusion, and I will just say it was bittersweet that it's over. And it is a wonderful conclusion. So if you're interested in giving this a go and never have, it is complete now, and you should read it. All right, and then 11 on my list is The Devil in the Dark Water. I just read this towards the end of the year, and I was pretty much blown away by it. I really enjoyed the audiobook, so that's the way I recommend you do it if you're at all interested in audiobooks. This is from the author of The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, and it could not be more different, except that it is a weird sort of mystery that is unlike anything else I'd ever read. So in that, it is similar to Evelyn Hardcastle, but this takes place in the 1600s aboard a ship, a merchant vessel bound for somewhere in the Netherlands, I've already forgotten. There is possibly a demonic presence on board, killing people. There may or may not be a leper that everyone already saw die, haunting the ship, and we're following this sort of motley crew of characters and getting a lot of different perspectives. There's this duo who, prior to the start of the book, were famous for solving crimes, a sort of Watson and Holmes scenario, except the Sherlock of this duo is in the brig, and no one knows why, except that he's being arrested and is on his way to his execution. So the Watson has to solve the crime, essentially. Then you have the guy who's in charge of the ship, his wife, his mistress, who is his wife's best friend, just crazy, varied characters, and I loved all of them, and I found it all so interesting. I never had any idea what was going on. You were on this ship for like 85-90% of the book, and it's a locked door mystery, right? But even more so because you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean. Whether or not it's haunted, that's the question. Whether or not any of this is really happening, is it just murders? Is it like, what's the motive? It's wild. I had a blast. Highly recommended. But I will say, it is so intensely researched and detailed, it very much reads like historical. So while it's a lot of fun and it has those thriller mystery elements and almost horror elements, it is historical fiction. I would say you could get bogged down in all of that the first, I don't know, like 15-20% of the book. You have to really push through to get to the action, because once that takes off, I guarantee you love it. All right, now we're breaking into the top 10, and my 10th on this list is Get a Life, Chloe Brown. I loved this. It is a blast. It's a romance between Chloe, who has chronic pain and has spent a lot of her life working from home, living as safely and as quietly as possible, but a near-death experience at the start of the book makes her decide she needs to break out of her shell and go live life. So she gets her own place and she starts making friends and like just kind of living her life in a new way. And that's how she meets Redford. Red is the super for her new building, and they don't get along initially. And he has a lot of stuff he's dealing with from a past abusive relationship, and he is an artist who no longer makes art. And between the two of them, they're dynamic. I just loved their banter, and I loved how much depth both of the characters had on their own, and the plot lines they had on their own, and then of course the plot line that brings them together. So well done. And then I followed it up by reading Danny Brown, the sequel. It's about Chloe's sister, and I enjoyed that one a lot too, but Chloe is my favorite for sure, at least so far. Number 9 on my list is The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. This is one of the best thrillers I read this year. It has dual timelines. You're following a woman who in the 80s takes a job as a night clerk at a motel, but then goes missing, leaves her purse and her stuff behind. No one ever figures out what happened to her. And then in present day, you're following her niece, who takes the same job at the same motel and is on a hunt to try and figure out what happened to her aunt. There are paranormal elements. There's a potential serial killer on the loose. And what I really loved about this is that I was so invested in both characters, in both timelines, in all the potential plot lines that are thrown at you in this book. I loved all of it, and it was all important to the conclusion you get at the end of the book. That is rare. Usually I like one character or one POV or one plot line more than the others, and it detracts from my overall enjoyment, and that just could not have been less of the case. And also a really great audiobook that has different narrators for each of the characters, which really added something for me. Number 8. The only graphic novel on my list, and this is Check Please Book 2, Sticks and Scones. So this is a graphic novel that follows Eric Biddy Biddle. The first book in this series is him starting at Samwell University, which is sort of like Yale, and he is closeted, and he is starting out on Samwell's hockey team. And hockey is not known for being the most inclusive, so he is keeping himself a secret. This book follows him in years 3 and 4 through graduation from Samwell as he continues to develop his relationships and make new friends and bake. He does a lot of baking and basically figure out what he wants to do post-college. This is such a slice of life, feel-good, wonderful series. It has a fantastic slow burn relationship, and the conclusion was the perfect payoff for the series. I have them both. I have books 1 and book 2. This is the whole series in 2 volumes. I just adore it. I would say it is my favorite graphic novel of all time. If you like hockey, if you like baking, if you like slice of life, if you just want a good LGBTQ story that's happy and fulfilling and fuzzy, please give this one a go. Number 7 on my list is The Book of Two Ways. This is the last or second to last book I read in 2020, and I really saved one of the best for last. It's only the second Jodi Picoult book I've read, but I adored it. I know it does not work for everybody, but it really worked for me. This book follows Dawn, who is in a plane crash at the start of the book, and from there we follow 2 storylines. We follow her going home post-crash to her husband and daughter in Boston, where she works as a death doula and has to deal with family issues and her relationships at home. And then we follow a storyline where after the plane crash, she goes to Egypt. Before this book, long before this book starts, she had been studying to get her PhD in Egyptology, and she had worked in Egypt, uncovering tombs and that sort of thing, and she had a relationship with another PhD student, and he is still there. So she's going to reunite with him to sort of pick up where she left off. So these are 2 very different paths, and they have different consequences. And you're alternating between Boston, Egypt, Boston, Egypt. The problem I think a lot of people had with this is how much Egyptology there is, especially towards the beginning. And then later in the book, there's also quantum physics. There's a lot about being a death doula and practices of death and death ceremony and that sort of thing. And the research that went into this is incredible. novel. I'm seeing people say this book reads like a textbook. I disagree with that. I love Egyptology. I love archaeology. I've been going to museums and reading books and watching documentaries on this my whole entire life. So I am biased in that I am interested in this topic to begin with, but I'm not interested in quantum physics, didn't know anything about being a death doula, but those elements, even though they are also heavily researched and very, very detailed, I also found interesting. So if you are struggling to get through the very beginning, I would say that is the heaviest Egyptology and archaeology elements that are in the entire book, so I would push through. But for me, this moving, jaw-dropping, I don't even know if I can put it into words. I just felt like my heart got ripped out of my chest. In a good way. I loved everything about it. Loved what Dawn was doing and the choices she was making, but how this book was meticulously laid out because it's so complex, and all of the research that went into it, and all of the very different characters and how well developed they all are, I just was blown away. Like, this is a book that I feel should have taken Jodi Picoult like 10 years to write. I think her last book was published like just a year before. So she's, I don't know, a master. I'm so impressed with it. And if that sounds at all interesting to you, I would highly recommend you give it a go. Number 6 on my list, this is the only book on this list that has not yet come out. This is People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, who also wrote Beach Read. I loved Beach Read so much, I did not think another book of hers could top it, and yet here we are. So this doesn't come out until 2021, but I got an arc of it on NetGalley and I loved it even more than Beach Read. This follows a friends to lovers sort of relationship. Alex and Poppy meet in college. They're initially not friendly, but then eventually become friends. Poppy is a travel blogger, and so once a year she drags Alex with her on one of her trips. So they take a yearly vacation until something happens on one of their vacations and they haven't spoken to each other since, and it's been a few years. So we don't know what led to their estrangement. So you're following 2 timelines. You're following a timeline that shows you the development of their relationship, and then over the years as their relationship evolved from trip to trip, vacation to vacation. And then you're alternating between that with present day when they are reuniting and how their relationship goes from that reunion. All of this surrounds this moment that led to their estrangement, and you don't know what it is, so you suspect. I generally don't love friends to lovers because I don't find it convincing. Unlike hate to love, where I feel like the passion is right there, it's just the other side of the line. For me, friends to lovers is actually harder to believe because if you've been friends with someone for years, I mean, you know someone, right? You know them, you've been their friend for years. Either you're interested in that and in that way, in that person, or you're not. So I usually have trouble with friends to lovers. This one, guys, I just kept thinking about it for days. I still think I'm in book hangover, like 3 months later. I want to read it again desperately. It's so, so good. I'm so excited for it to come out and start seeing people reading it more and reviewing it more because I think you're gonna love it. Even if you didn't love Beach Read, I think you have a good shot at loving People We Meet on Vacation. The intimacies of their relationship were so beautifully and realistically written. I feel like I know them, and I was sad that I didn't have more of their story after the book ended, and I want what they have. It's rare that a romance novel genuinely makes me envious of a relationship, something I want for myself, but this book did that, and that is like romance goals. So, I need to reread it. All right, now we've made it to the top 5. Number 5 on my list is The Idea of You by Robin Lee. This is another romance. This is one that is a little bit challenging to recommend to people, but almost every single person I've recommended it to has loved it. 4 or 5 stars. It is about a 39-year-old divorced woman with a middle school aged daughter who takes her daughter to a concert for her favorite band. It's a British boy band called August Moon. And then they have like a backstage thing they go to after the concert. And there, our main character, Selene, meets the lead singer of the band, Hayes Campbell. And from there, they start a relationship. It is very Harry Styles. It is very fanfiction-y, but honestly, it is so well written. Like, for what it sounds like, I was blown away by how well written this is. Robin Lee is an actress. She's been in a lot of stuff I have seen. She also went to Columbia Law, I believe, for a debut and for a romance. Also, the steamy scenes are like top notch. I closed this book just wrecked in a good way. Wrecked in a good way. I just loved it and I highly recommend you read it. Vogue magazine actually just released an article about how this book was like the sleeper hit of quarantine and how it's been a sensation in 2020 even though it was released originally in 2017, I believe. I'll link that article down below if you want to check it out, but if you won't listen to Vogue, listen to me. Read this book. Number 4 on my list is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, yet another amazing thriller. This is YA about Pip, who for her senior project decides to reinvestigate a crime that is considered closed that happened a few years ago in her small hometown. So Andy Bell, who was this pretty popular girl, went missing, and then her boyfriend, Sal Singh, his body was found with a suicide note saying, "I killed Andy, I'm sorry, I can't live with myself." Except Pip doesn't believe it. Everyone else in town does. Case closed. Easy. Pip knew Sal and does not believe he was capable of killing anybody. And also, Andy's body was never found. So what happened to her, right? So I would recommend you listen to this one as an audiobook because it is fully immersive, full cast. All of the interviews and all that are done with multiple narrators. It feels like listening to a true crime podcast. If that's at all interesting to you, honestly, I just didn't see any of the twists coming. Even elements that I thought I had figured out got spun around and twisted on me, and I just loved it. I just had a blast, and I'm very excited to read the sequel, which is about to come out. I'm very excited. Number 3 on my list is my only nonfiction I'm including this time, and it is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is a very short, very quick read, another amazing audiobook that's actually narrated by the author. His voice is such a powerful element that it adds a lot to the reading of this story. It's not really a story, it's a letter, actually. It's written as a letter to his teenage son, and it talks about how Ta-Nehisi Coates grew up in Baltimore, went to Howard University, then moved to be a writer in New York, and how he sort of became his own man, how he developed his ideologies and everything he knows about being a black man in America. And then he talks to his son about his concerns and his hopes and his dreams for his son also growing up a black man in America. This is incredible. It was so powerful. I think I listened to it in one day. It's one of the few audiobooks that I've listened to where I literally did not want to multitask. I just wanted to sit there and listen. And I did, and I'm so glad I did. And it is just mind-blowing. Second to last on my list, my only historical fiction I think that was on the list, but this is Where the Lost Wander by Amy Harmon. This came out in early 2020 and I read it, and I've now read it 3 times. 3 times. This follows 2 characters. Naomi, who is a very young widow who decides to go with her parents and siblings on the Oregon Trail. I think they're going to Oregon. And then the other perspective we're getting is John Lowry, who is a half-white, half-Pawnee man who is working the wagon train. And you're following their relationship as it develops. You're following John as he doesn't really fit in with the white people on the wagon train, but he also doesn't really have a place with the Pawnee. There's a lot of grief and loss and hope. It doesn't pull any punches as far as how hard this was for people who traveled on the Oregon Trail, and just, oh man, it's a tough one. It's a tough one, but I loved it. It's rare that historical fiction captures me so intensely, but this one did it. Highly recommended. There are a lot of trigger warnings though, so I would check it out if you have concerns about that. But goodness, also look at that beautiful cover. Okay, my number 1 read from 2020. I think if you've been watching my videos, you probably know what this is gonna be. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. Probably, I've already talked about this too much. Probably you've heard this talked about too much, so I'm gonna keep it brief. But this is a standalone sort of fantasy novel about Addie, who in the early 1700s is 23 and is about to be married off against her will. So she makes a deal with essentially the devil for freedom. She wants a free life. She doesn't want to have to do anything she doesn't want to do. She wants to explore the world and meet people and just not be trapped. And he gives her her wish, but he also curses her. So the loophole here is that yes, she gets to be free, but so she will essentially live as long as she wants. She can live forever, but when she finally gives up, decides to end her life, her soul will go to the devil. And also, she is cursed to be forgotten by everyone she ever meets. So as soon as she leaves their line of sight, it's like they've never met her. That includes her family, friends, lovers, doesn't matter. She will never be remembered until one day in present day, she is remembered. This is so beautifully written and so emotional, and it's not plot heavy and it's not anything predictable. It is just gorgeous and so deeply and intensely written and deeply intensely felt by me, and it deserves all the hype that it's getting. I will say it took me a little bit to get into it. I'd say like the first 15-20% I kind of struggled to like really get hooked, but once I did, game over. Like I just powered through it, even though it's not a short book. The writing is so spectacular, and you can tell how personal and how invested V.E. Schwab is in this book and in these characters, and I just respected her for it. It's like she cut herself open and bled on these pages. I just want to read it again, but I want to wait and let it kind of stew for a little bit and then pick it up and read it again because I loved it so much. I've now successfully gotten like 6 or 7 people to read this, and almost all of them have felt the same way I did. So if you are on the fence about this one, I highly recommend you give it a go. So that's it. Those are my favorite 15 books I read in 2020. It was a good year overall reading wise. I read a lot of crappy stuff for sure, but I read so much that I loved, and that's wonderful. That's all you can ask for. Let me know what you thought of these 15 books down below. Let me know what your favorite books of 2020 were, and I guess I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye.